Good morning or good afternoon, whatever time of day it is for you. So I told you yesterday that we would go ahead and read this book together. If you are able to get this book from the school, that's wonderful. You can follow along with me and you'll have a better opportunity to see all the pictures inside. If you weren't able to get it or you aren't going to get it, that's okay too. You can still listen to the story and I will stop and show you the pictures along the way. I decided to bring my friend, my sloth friend, along with me as we read. So if you have a nice stuffed animal or even your dog or brother or sister that you want to snuggle with while you read, that is a great idea. So today we're going to do chapter 1. The story is called George's Secret Key to the Universe. I was actually assigned to this book when I was a student in getting my master's degree, and I loved it, especially since his name is George. And also, it is written by Lucy and Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking is an extremely famous scientist, and Lucy is his daughter. And they together wrote this. So all of the science that is in this book is actually accurate. But then there's some fiction, some things that couldn't really happen. So that's what makes it a fun story. So let's start with chapter 1. Pigs don't just vanish, thought George as he stood staring into the depths of the very obviously empty pigsty. He tried closing his eyes and then opening them again to see if it was all some kind of horrible optical illusion, meaning his eyes were playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the pig was still gone. His vast, muddy pink bulk nowhere to be seen. In fact, when George examined the situation for a second time, it had gotten worse, not better. The side door of the pigsty, he noticed, was hanging open, which meant someone hadn't shut it properly, and that someone was probably him. "Georgie," he heard his mother call from the kitchen. "I'm going to start supper in a minute, so you've only got about an hour. Have you done your homework?" "Yes, Mom," he called back in a fake cheery voice. "How's your pig?" "He's fine, fine," said George squeakily. He threw in a few experimental oinks, just to make it sound as though everything was business as usual. Here in the small backyard that was full of many, many vegetables and one enormous, but now mysteriously absent, pig. He grunted a few more times for effect. Oink, 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 oink. It was very important his mother did not come out into the garden before George had time to think of a plan. How he was going to find the pig, put it back in the sty, close the door, and get back in time for supper, he had no idea. But he was working on it. And the last thing he needed was for one of his parents to appear before he had all the answers. George knew the pig was not exactly popular with his parents. His mother and father had never wanted a pig in the backyard, and his dad in particular tended to grind his teeth quite hard when he remembered who lived beyond the vegetable patch. This is reminding me of Benson's pig. The pig had been a present one cold Christmas Eve a few years back. A cardboard box full of squeaks and snuffles had been delivered to their front door. When George opened it up, he found a very indignant, so probably a little upset, pink piglet inside. George lifted him carefully out of the box and watched with delight as his new friend skidded around the Christmas tree on his tiny hooflets. There had been a note taped to the box. "Dear all," it read, "Merry Christmas. This little fellow needs a home. Can you give him one? Love, Grandma, XXX." So in the picture on the left, looks like George is looking for the pig, and the picture on the right is a picture of what the pig looked like when he was delivered to George's house in the little box. George's dad hadn't been delighted by the new addition to his family. Just because he was a vegetarian, it didn't mean he liked animals. So vegetarians are people who only eat vegetables. They don't eat meat. Actually, he preferred plants. They were much easier to deal with. They didn't make a mess or leave muddy hoof prints on the kitchen floor or break in and eat all the cookies left out on the table. But George was thrilled to have his very own pig. The presents he'd received from his mom and dad that year were, as usual, pretty awful. The home-knitted purple and orange striped sweater from his mom had sleeves that stretched right down to the floor. He had never wanted a xylophone, and he had a hard time looking enthusiastic when he wrapped a build-your-own ant farm. What George really wanted, above all things in the universe, was a computer. But he knew his parents were very unlikely to buy him one. Ooh, there's one of our prefixes. They didn't like modern inventions and tried to do without as many standard household items as they could, wanting to live a purer, simpler life. They washed all their clothes by hand and didn't own a car and lit the house with candles in order to avoid using any electricity. So they don't use light bulbs, they don't have computers, they don't have televisions, those things that we're used to having around. It was all designed to give George a natural and improving upbringing, free from toxins, additives, radiation, and other such evil phenomena. The only problem was that in getting rid of everything that could possibly harm George, his parents had managed to do away with lots of things that would also be fun for him. George's parents might enjoy going on environmental protest marches or grinding flour to make their own bread, but George didn't. He wanted to go to a theme park and ride on the roller coasters or play computer games or take an airplane somewhere far, far away. Instead, for now, all he had was his pig. And this is the picture of their kitchen. You can see all the plants and George is standing at the counter. And a very fine pig he was too. George named him Freddie and spent many happy hours dangling over the edge of the pigsty his father had built in the backyard, watching Freddie root around in the straw or snuffle in the dirt. As the seasons changed and the years turned, George's piglet got bigger and bigger and bigger, until he was so large that in dim lighting he looked like a baby elephant. The bigger Freddie grew, the more he seemed to feel cooped up in his pigsty, because his space would feel smaller. Whenever he got the chance, he liked to escape and rampage across the vegetable patch, trampling on the carrot tops, munching the baby cabbages, and chewing up George's mom's flowers. Even though she often told George how important it was to love all living creatures, George suspected that on days when Freddie wrecked her garden, she didn't feel much love for his pig. Like George's dad, his mom was a vegetarian, but George was sure he had heard her angrily mutter "sausages" under her breath when she was cleaning up after one of Freddie's more destructive outings. Sausage comes from pigs. On this particular day, however, it wasn't the vegetables that Freddie had destroyed. Instead of charging madly about, the pig had done something much worse. In the fence that separated George's garden from the one next door, George suddenly noticed a suspiciously pig-sized hole. It reminds me of the story we read with the two dogs and the boy that was stuck. Yesterday, it definitely hadn't been there. But then yesterday, Freddie had been safely shut in his sty, and now he was nowhere to be seen. It meant only one thing, that Freddie, in his search for adventure, had burst out of the safety of the backyard and gone somewhere he absolutely should not have gone. Next door was a mysterious place. So something that's mysterious has more questions about it than answers. It had been empty for as long as George could remember, while all the other houses in the row had neatly kept backyards, windows that twinkled with light in the evenings, and doors that slammed as people ran in and out. This house just sat there, sad, quiet, and dark. No small children squeaked with joy early in the morning. No mother called out of the back door to bring people in for supper. On the weekends, there was no noise of hammering or smell of fresh paint because no one ever came to fix the broken window frames or clear the sagging gutters. Years of neglect being ignored meant the garden had rioted out of control until it looked like the Amazon jungle had grown up on the other side of the fence. On George's side, the backyard was neat, orderly, and very boring. There were rows of string beans strictly tied to stakes, lines of floppy lettuces, frothy dark green carrot tops, and well-behaved potato plants. George couldn't even kick a ball without it landing splat in the middle of a carefully tended blueberry bush and squashing it. George's parents had marked out a little area for George to grow his own vegetables, hoping he would become interested in gardening and perhaps grow up to be an organic farmer. But George preferred looking up at the sky to looking down at the earth. So here's a picture of George. It looks like he's climbing over the fence. And you can see the neighbor's yard, how it's just overgrown with all those plants. So, his little patch of the planet stayed bare and scratchy, showing nothing but stones, scrubby weeds, and bare ground, while he tried to count all the stars in the sky to find out how many there were. Next door, however, was completely different. George often stood on the top of the pigsty roof and gazed over the fence into the glorious, tangled forest beyond. The sweeping bushes made cozy little hidey holes, while the trees had curved, gnarled branches, perfect for a boy to climb. Brambles grew in great clumps, their spiky arms bending into strange, wavy loops, crisscrossing each other like train tracks at a station. In summer, twisty bindweed clung on to every other plant in the garden like a green cobweb. Yellow dandelions sprouted everywhere. Prickly, poisonous giant hogweed loomed like a species from another planet, while little blue forget-me-not flowers winked prettily in the crazy bright green jumble of next door's backyard. But next door was also forbidden territory. It means he was not allowed to go there. George's parents had very firmly said no to the idea of George using it as an extra playground. And it hadn't been their normal sort of no, which was a wishy-washy, kindly, we're asking you not to for your own sake sort of no. This had been a real no, the kind you didn't argue with. It was the same no that George had encountered when he tried suggesting that, as everyone else at school had a television set, some kids even had one in their bedroom, maybe his parents could think about buying one. On the subject of television, George had had to listen to a long explanation from his father about how watching mindless trash would pollute his brain. But when it came to next door, he didn't even get a lecture from his dad. Just a flat, conversation-ending no. George, however, always liked to know why. Guessing he wasn't going to get any more answers from his dad, he asked his mother instead. "Oh, George," she had sighed as she chopped up Brussels sprouts and turnips and threw them into the cake mix. She tended to cook with whatever came to hand rather than with ingredients that would actually combine to make something tasty. "You ask too many questions. I just want to know why I can't go next door," George persisted. "And if you tell me, I won't ask any more questions for the rest of the day. I promise." His mom wiped her hands on her flowery apron and took a sip of nettle tea. "All right, George," she said. "I'll tell you a story if you stir the muffins." Passing over the big brown mixing bowl and the wooden spoon, she settled herself down as George started to beat the stiff yellow dough with the green and white vegetable specks together. So there's a picture of his mom telling the story and he's stirring the muffin mix. When we first moved here, his mom began, when you were very small, an old man lived in that house. We hardly ever saw him, but I remember him well. He had the longest beard I have ever seen. It went right down to his knees. No one knew how old he really was, but the neighbors said he'd lived there forever. What happened to him? Asked George, who'd already forgotten that he'd promised not to ask any more questions. Nobody knows, said his mom mysteriously. What do you mean? Asked George, who had stopped stirring. Just that, said his mom. One day he was there, the next day he wasn't. Maybe he went on vacation, said George. If he did, he never came back, said his mom. Eventually they searched the house, but there was no sign of him. The house has been empty ever since, and no one has ever seen him again. Gosh, said George. A little while back, his mom continued blowing on her hot tea. We heard noises next door, banging sounds in the middle of the night. There were flashing lights and voices as well. Some squatters had broken in and were living there. So a squatter is somebody who finds an abandoned place and just lives there. So they didn't actually buy it or earn it. They just kind of took it over. The police had to throw them out. Just last week, we thought we heard the noises again. We don't know who might be in that house. That's why your dad doesn't want you going around there, Georgie. As George looked at the big black hole in the fence, he remembered the conversation he'd had with his mom. The story she told him hadn't stopped him from wanting to go next door. It still looked mysterious and enticing. But wanting to go next door when he knew he couldn't was one thing. Finding out he actually had to was quite another. Suddenly, next door seemed dark, spooky, and very scary. George felt torn. Part of him just wanted to go home to the flickery candlelight and funny, familiar smells of his mother's cooking. To close the back door and be safe and snug inside his own house once more. But that would mean leaving Freddie alone and possibly in danger. He couldn't ask his parents for any help in case they decided that this was the final black mark against Freddie's name and packed him off to be made into bacon. Taking a deep breath, George decided he had to do it. He had to go next door. Closing his eyes, he plunged through the hole in the fence. When he came out on the other side and opened his eyes, he was right in the middle of the jungle garden. Above his head, the tree cover was so dense, so thick, he could hardly see the sky. It was getting dark now, and the thick forest made it even darker. George could just see where a path had been trampled through the enormous weeds. He followed it, hoping it would lead him to Freddie. I wonder who made that path. He waded through great banks of brambles, which grabbed at his clothes, the little thorny bushes, and scratched his bare skin. They seemed to reach out in the semi-darkness to scrape their prickly spines along his arms and legs. Okay, here's a picture. Looks like he's just gotten into the garden, and you can see the thick trees overhead and all the plants. Muddy old leaves squished under his feet, and nettles attacked him with their sharp, stinging fingers. So when an author gives people characteristics to things that aren't people, like telling you that these nettles had arms and that they have fingers, it's called personification. And it's a fun way to write because things get really interesting. All the while, the wind in the trees above him made a singing, sighing noise, as though the leaves were saying, "Be careful, Georgie. Be careful, Georgie." The trail brought George into a sort of clearing right behind the house itself. So far, he had not seen or heard any sign of his wayward pig. But there, on the broken paving stones outside the back door, he saw only too clearly a set of muddy hoof prints. From the marks, George could tell exactly which way Freddie had gone. His pig had marched straight into the abandoned house through the back door, which had been pushed open just wide enough for a fat pig to squeeze through. Worse, from the house where no one had lived for years and years, a beam of light shone. Somebody was home. That is the end of chapter 1. If you go back to page 8, there's a section that is a different color. It's dark gray. It has some facts about the sky. So since I'm finished with the chapter, I'm going to read you those facts. These are the things that are true, that are scientifically true. So the first fact in the star-shaped piece says, during the day, there is only one star that can be seen in the sky. It is the star that is the closest to us, the star that has the most effect on our daily lives and for which we have a special name. You probably guessed it, the sun. Okay, next to that, there's a picture of a moon. And it says in the circle, the moon and the planets do not shine on their own. They don't shine like the sun does. They appear bright at night because the sun lights them up. Kind of like if you shine a flashlight onto something, that thing might glow. That's what's happening with the sun. It's making the moon shine because it's shining its light on it. Down at the bottom left-hand corner under the star, it says, in the night sky, there are a few objects that can be seen that are not stars, the moon and the planets, like Venus, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn. And the last part says, all the other shining dots in the night sky are stars like our sun. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but they are all stars. With a naked eye, meaning you don't have a telescope or binoculars, on a clear night, away from sources of light like cities, we can see hundreds of them. And the reason those other stars that are like the sun are so small is because they're really, really far away. All right, well, I look forward to reading with you again for chapter 2. I hope you're enjoying it so far. See you later.